Welcome to the Matt Waller Podcast, where we look at success at the intersection of technology, logistics, supply chain, retail, and CPG, also known as the retail value chain. I want to clarify that this podcast is distinct from my responsibilities as a professor in the Sam M. Walton College of Business. Nonetheless, it aligns with my aspiration to provide practical insights to professionals and business by showcasing companies and people that can enhance your ability to manage, lead, and strategize and market effectively in the retail value chain. Before we dive into today's exciting episode, I'd like to thank our sponsor, New Road Capital Partners. New Road invests in proven technologies, services, and products that serve unmet needs in the marketplace. They look for companies in supply chain and logistics, as well as consumer-oriented companies. For more information, go to newroadcp.com. I would also like to disclose that I am a strategic advisor to New Road. I'd also like to recognize podcastvideos.com for the services they provide for these podcasts. I'm very pleased with their services. And now, without further ado, let's get into the exciting episode. I have with me today Josh Stanley, and we're talking about a new entity that he has stood up called FieldBook Venture Studio. You're going to really find this interesting. If you don't know the difference between, say, an incubator or an accelerator or a venture studio, you're going to learn about the differences. In addition to that, you're going to learn about how you could potentially be involved in it here in Northwest Arkansas. It's a big deal. This is a big deal for Northwest Arkansas. It really plays to our strength, as you will hear about in a little bit. And Josh is a great one to explain this because Josh has started 6 companies. He's had successful exits. He moved to Northwest Arkansas from Las Vegas, where his company was purchased by a company here in Northwest Arkansas, and he moved here in part because of that. But you're going to hear from someone who really knows about entrepreneurship, running early-stage companies, creating new ideas, and we need that in Northwest Arkansas. There's a lot of empirical evidence that new company formation is one of the most important drivers of wealth creation and employment in the country. So I think you'll find this very interesting. And again, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn. He visited and studied 12 different venture studios before he put this idea together. And wait till you hear some of the results of that study that he did. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. Josh, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, today we're going to be talking about FieldBook, a new venture studio that you are creating in partnership with High Alpha, which is one of the most well-known venture studios in the world. But before we do that, there's 2 things I'd like to do. One, I would like you to explain what a venture studio is and how it differs from an accelerator and an incubator. And 2, I would like you to talk a little bit about the research that you did before you came up with this idea.
Okay.
Because you studied a bunch of, you studied 12 of the top venture studios out there.
Yeah. We can get going with what is a venture studio. I think to your point, in the need to define that, the word studio gets attached to a lot of things, and even venture studio, I think, lacks a clear definition because it gets used in a lot of different ways. When we say venture studio or startup studio, and there is a difference between those two kind of concepts as well, but when we say it, it's the idea of identifying an opportunity in a market, validating that opportunity, finding a co-founder who has a unique skill set, network, what have you, that allows them to be a force multiplier to that concept, and forming and funding that concept. That would be the full, simplest version of a venture studio. So the key things to your call outs around incubator and accelerator that make it different. Key things around an incubator, it's closer to an incubator than an accelerator, and I'll say this first. Incubators go out in the market and look for founders. They're going out and saying, hey, people who have good ideas, people who have concepts, maybe they have some traction, maybe they don't. There's varying degrees of progress that they might be looking for, but they're out there looking for established founders or budding early stage, haven't made the leap yet founders who have concepts that they want to build. So it's really founder-centric, and an accelerator tends to be startup-centric, meaning that it's like a little later on average, and it's saying, hey, startups that have already got some traction, maybe you're at pre-seed, maybe you're at seed, maybe you're at Series A, you're in this, varied spectrum of progress or traction, come on into our accelerator, we'll help you get to the next stage, whatever that might be. Again, there's varying degrees. So incubator, accelerator, really just play in different life cycles of the startup space, but they assume a founder or a company has already been created or have already been identified with an opportunity identified. Venture studio, startup studio model doesn't assume any of that. It just looks at the market and says, what opportunities exist? All right, let's go take some time in one particular area and identify what potential concepts can be created, and then we'll work those concepts through a validation cycle to get to a place where we can have confidence in one or more ideas. Then we'll go find our special person. We're going to special one or two or three individuals, co-founders, to attach to that concept. And we truly co-found with them at that point. So that's that in itself, and sorry to kind of talk through it from two different sides, but it's like that's the studio model. And then I'll throw out too this one, like what is a venture studio? What is a startup studio? Really, they're both the same. When you say venture studio, you should be referring to the idea that there's a sidecar fund attached to it. So let's say me and you start a startup studio tomorrow. We raise $10 million. $5 million of that likely is going to go towards the operation. Pays for a team to exist to do all that work we just talked about. The identification, market opportunity, competitive analysis, user research, potential customer research, all that stuff. A lot of work, a lot of expertise. We need to pay people to do that. So that it's different than your traditional VC world, right? Which operates on a 2% management fee, 20% carry kind of base. This is, no, you've got operational costs up front. So a startup studio is paying for all that operational costs, and then it deploys some of its capital into the earliest stage to form and fund. And the venture studio, that is an evolution of that model, which High Alpha, I think, was one of, if not the first to do, which said, hey, we'll have a fund that runs the startup studio, and we're going to have this sidecar fund over here, and that an extra $10 million. What does that $10 million do? It can invest in any company. So it'll go outside the scope of these captive companies inside the studio. But it's really there to double down on the best companies coming out of that studio. So, if you're going to start 5 companies over a 3-year period in a studio fund, you have this sidecar fund that can say, oh, well, that one opportunity is taking off. Like one of the 5 is really scaling. I'm going to double down and I'm going to participate pro rata in the next round and maybe even follow-on rounds beyond that. So it's this interesting combination of a venture capital fund and a studio all in one. And there's a lot of debate online or on LinkedIn, and there is no Bible around this is what it means. But that's my definition and how I've seen it.
There's an infinite number of ways to do business.
Yeah. There's so many different flavors of how you could approach this. And even within what I've said, there's dual entity structures, there's so many nuances to how you approach even kind of foundationally building the studio. That gets interesting, but that's convoluted for this conversation. And then to hit on what you had asked about on top of that, the kind of where this all started. So I had met the High Alpha team maybe 6 years ago. Myself and Joe Somweber, one of the co-founders of RevUnit, had flown out to participate in a sprint week six or so years ago in Indianapolis, where High Alpha, the parent company or parent studio, venture studio, is based. And I was like, man, this makes sense to me. Being an entrepreneur who started 2 companies at that point, I was like, this idea of having one team get really good. It's manufacturing, right? You're manufacturing startups. One team gets really good at that first stage. And if there's something I learned at Teamwork and RevUnit, my previous experiences, these agency companies, it's what got us to 1 million in revenue at Teamwork, what got us to 15 million in revenue at RevUnit, up to 23 million in revenue. Like, to get from 1 to 23, there's different things along the way. Like the organizational structure, the life cycle of that was so different from 0 to 1 million, from 1 to 5, from 5 to 15. Different things were needed. Like what got us here won't get us there kind of mentality. That really proved true. And so thinking about it from a place of like, oh, this team just gets really good at that one life cycle stage, like incredibly good at it. That makes sense to me. It's like, I want to do that. That's where I had the most fun. Like starting things is among one of the most fun things to do. But yeah, this idea of in 2021, when we co-founded Cartwheel, started from a place of let's just go talk to a bunch of venture studios, startup studios. So yeah, we did talk to 12 different studios, among which High Alpha and High Alpha Innovation were in that group. Others like PSL and Atomic and Polymath. We talked to a bunch of different studios across the spectrum of types of studios. And I would say the biggest things I learned in that, number one, like everybody had a different approach. How they validated, how they built a thesis was different from studio to studio. The top, what I frame as top tier studios, I would put Pioneer Square Labs out of Washington and High Alpha out of Indiana in those buckets. Like they were just rigorous. They had different approaches, different processes to launching companies, to validating. In fact, in some ways, pretty dramatically different, but they had similar outcomes. Like both were in the high 90% success rate, which is unheard of and crazy, right? Like, I think out of the first 20 companies High Alpha had built 5 years in, so 5 years or older, the first 20 companies, 16 of them were still around, thriving, and a few exits had already occurred. So it's just, you just have this insane success rate coming out of that model, which I attribute to, and I think a lot of the people in that model attribute to this idea of, if I can get the founder to focus on the customer and the product in the earliest stage and not worry about business admin and all the administrative functions, if I just get them to focus on those two things, you're going to improve the probability. You're going to improve the probability of success of that startup. And I think that was consistent. Like how they serviced and supported was consistent. How they came about their ideas validated them very different. So like, I think that was my main takeaway of all the possible takeaways I could point to out of talking to 12 different studios, is just what matters is giving someone space to focus on the product and the customers.
And didn't you find that the best outcomes occurred when there's an unfair advantage established pre-launch?
Yeah, that's a great call out. Yeah, the studios that have some kind of, like if you look at High Alpha, made up of mostly the partner team, mostly former Exact Target partners, people who came out of digital marketing. And so they had an unfair advantage in digital marketing. In fact, maybe most of, if not all of the companies coming out of kind of the first cohort from High Alpha were digital marketing aligned in some capacity. Like they just leaned into what they were great at. I think that was their unfair advantage, to your point. Like they had the network, they had the connection, they had the experience, they understood that landscape, they knew where the pitfalls were. So I think, yes, if you understand a particular industry or sector, or maybe you have some sort of like superpower around a particular type of tech that can be applied in lots of verticals, I think whatever your unfair advantage is, you do need that. Like that is a core ingredient to a good or a successful studio. What would be core? Like, again, just my own definition of what top tier studios look like.
Well, High Alpha is pretty well known. I can't remember when I first learned about it, but it's been a while. And I read somewhere, I think it was on their website, that just since 2012 2021, they've launched 15 startups, and they're having incredible success with those startups.
Yeah.
They'd already done it before, but it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and I may have misrepresented the numbers. It may have been like 23 out of 24 were still around 5 years later. I think 16 out of 20 were all in Indiana. Yeah, that was my stat. Yeah. But, I mean, so yeah, they've had a high success rate. I don't know what their current, I mean, they're in the 30s now, to your point. I don't know what their success rate looks like now, but, because I haven't checked it in a minute. But yeah, PSL, similar numbers, like similar, high 20s, high success rate. So doing it differently.
And I've read in multiple places now that one thing High Alpha does, one of their idiosyncrasies, are these sprint weekends. And the sprint weekends are a week.
Yeah.
It's a whole week. It's 5 days. People that participate, and they try to come out with 4 to 6 companies from that.
Yeah.
And they may have as many as 60 people participate in that.
Right.
And they have to come up with a minimum viable. So they have the ideas already.
Yes.
But they have to come up with a minimum viable company.
Yes.
Within a week.
Yeah.
Everyone that participates is not allowed to set up any other meetings during the week. They're really strict about this.
Yeah. I think they've mastered it, honestly. I think through iteration, like all people who care about continuous improvement. But yeah, you have a whole week dedicated to pre-validated concepts. So you're not doing the like heavy upfront lifting of validating, but you're building teams around validated concepts with the intent of, well, let's run these 3-4 concepts through the gamut. Like, let's put really talented, intelligent people together, cross-functional talents come together around each of those concepts. So they form teams at the beginning of the sprint week, and then those teams are now competing essentially to prove that their concept is the best one and is worthy of forming and funding.
Well, and it makes sense. I mean, a venture studio is an organization creating these businesses. And so consequently, it makes sense for them to take higher equity position than they would if someone had come to them with an idea.
Right.
But I think this is something that people wonder about sometimes.
Yeah.
I looked at some recent, there's an article in the Harvard Business Review on venture studios, and it came out in 2022. So think about that.
Yeah.
I believe the first venture studio was created in like 1998 or something like that.
Yeah. I want to say it's Idea Lab, if I remember.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
But it's taken a long time to catch on, it seems like. Now, I know High Alpha is going around partnering with companies to do that, similar to what they're doing with you.
Yep.
But venture studios often take between 30 and 80%, depends on the situation.
Right.
Whereas an accelerator might take 5 to 10%. This is according to the HBR article.
Yeah.
10 to 30% for seed capital and 10 to 30% for venture capital. And this is an article, December 13th, 2022, Steve Blank, Entrepreneurs, is a venture studio right for you? It's a really good article. But this, and there's famous companies that have come out of this, come out of venture studios. Moderna is one that everyone would recognize.
Right.
But there's many others like Overture, Twilio, Bentley.
Snowflake technically came out of us.
Oh, is that right? Yeah. So the ideas are just working. This idea seems to be working.
Yeah, if you look at the stats, you're 4 times more likely to exit if you're formed in a venture studio. You're 4 times more likely to achieve $1 billion valuation. You get to seed and series rounds faster than you do under traditional formation, which just signals to traction and velocity. I'm not saying that that's a measure of success per se, but it does it's a leading indicator of success. And I think, there's a lot of proof in the pudding around. Now, there's a lot of proof in the pudding around the idea that you can achieve a higher probability of success building startups out of a studio. Now, having said that, do we have enough data? Just like the venture fund world, you got to go through a 10-year cycle, right? You need a 10-year cycle, and you need a couple before you really start to understand what works and doesn't. And I don't know that we're fully there yet. Like maybe the first fund of High Alpha is approaching its first 10-year life cycle, and the PSL is probably in a similar camp. Like they formed around the same time. Those are the two that I probably spend the most time kind of researching. But yeah, we haven't had a ton of this. We haven't seen a lot of this asset class have a full 10-year cycle yet, or even go through a second tier of that. And that's when that's when I believe we'll start seeing real kind of hard and fast numbers around how successful this model is. But even the early data tells you there's something about creating a very kind of protective space for a startup, right? Protective in the sense of like, I'm going to try to block out all the nonsense for you. Like you shouldn't be responding to your state's, filing requests and like dealing with your accounting. And like, yes, those are all things that are important to the business and you got to learn it and own it. But like at the first stage, all that really matters is do we have product market fit? And can we close deals? Do people buy, right? I can talk to you and you say, that's a good idea. But when I ask you to get your wallet out, how good of an idea is it now? That's what you got to do. And I think it's, in the simplest terms, like boiling down to that is why this model works.
So recently there was an announcement about your funding of FieldBook. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. So VentureWell is a nonprofit organization that is partnered with Walton Family Foundation, and we've been working with them. We've been working on this total program for almost 2 years now, but I've worked with VentureWell around this idea of launching FieldBook here in the region. It's a $10 million fund, of which $5 million of that comes from the Walton Family Foundation through VentureWell, and $5 million of it comes from the state. So that's the ADFA team at the state of Arkansas, which technically I think is not the state, but is this group that's set aside to help manage investments for the state of Arkansas. And so those two parties with VentureWell come together to launch FieldBook. We're Cartwheel and High Alpha Innovation are the teams executing on that program. So we're the ones actually running the team on the ground, and then High Alpha Innovation is the team providing the shared service layer and kind of bringing their playbook to the table. So Cartwheel is directly partnering and integrating with High Alpha Innovation. We're going to be leveraging their playbook, taking advantage of some of the kind of more mature processes that they've been working on for going on 5+ years now, alongside the High Alpha parent company that's been doing this for maybe 7 years or more now. I'm sure they're listening to this and saying my dates are all wrong, but they've been doing it a while. Let's just say that. They've been doing it a while. They've got more cycles and reps on this model than we do, so we're really leaning in on their approach, applying what we've learned doing the same model for the last 2 years at Cartwheel. But I think there's a superpower there. And I think the thing that makes me most excited about High Alpha Innovation is that they've definitely figured out the accelerate side of the pipeline. And by that I mean like once you've launched the company, once you've formed, or in our instance with this studio, we are going to be building the companies inside the studio. So it's a little different. It's going to look different than what I started describing. Like the form and funding actually won't happen until a year into the incubation of these companies. So we're going to keep the companies in the studio for the first 12 months of their post the identification of the concepts that we want to launch. We're going to have them inside the studio working with us, side by side with us. But High Alpha Innovation really has nailed this accelerate team. They have a whole team around supporting CEO, entrepreneur in residence, like people who are running these kinds of companies, helping them with the sales process, helping them identify new team members. Like they just have that all figured out in ways that we have not invested in at Cartwheel. So I'm very excited about that. Excited about working with them in general, bringing them into the state, what we can do with VentureWell and the experiences they have in the entrepreneurial ecosystem from a nonprofit lens, helping universities and other kind of organizations that are seeking to drive economic development. Like they've spent a ton of time in that space, bringing in High Alpha Innovation, who has spun up studios at universities and built startups with corporations. Cartwheel, which has been doing that here in Northwest Arkansas for the last 3 years now. That's compelling. Like, I think these three groups all coming together to build this studio, I'm very excited about it. So yeah, and just to say it, like we're gonna launch 5 companies with this FieldBook initial fund. We're gonna launch 5 companies over the next 3 years. So those are 5 technology businesses, most likely B2B, business to business software as a service companies, and hopefully the majority of our CEO, co-founder, entrepreneur in residence, and the supporting founding team members come out of this ecosystem. Will come out of your audience is a hope as well. You know, like really tapping into the amazing network that we have here in town.
Josh, if a brand or a person wants to get involved in this, how do they go about it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you're a brand, like we are going to be actively looking to work with businesses officed and or headquartered here in Arkansas. Like we want to work directly with corporations, with CPGs, with suppliers, with agencies, whoever. We want to be partnering with operators so that we're building solutions that solve problems they have. So that might look like reaching out to FieldBook.studio. Once that is a website that we have running, and it might be running by the time this comes out. Hopefully that is the URL at least, FieldBook.studio. But yeah, reaching out and saying, hey, we've identified problems. We know there's things that need to be solved for in X, Y, and Z space. We wish there was software to help solve this problem. Like, yeah, great. Let's get in a room and dig through what exactly the workflow is and what the problems are what are the pains to be solved for there. If you're an individual, it's, hey, please reach out to us. We are going to be running programming around entrepreneurial education with the intent of prepping individuals into running these businesses we're going to form over the next 3 years, these 5 companies we're going to form. We want to start providing educational content to potential founders. So even if you might or might not be, you know, that's a joint decision to be made, right? Like you have to decide that you want to be an entrepreneur and we have to decide that you're the right entrepreneur for a business. So it's not like it's a perfect matching system. It's more about just being in our ecosystem, I think. And so we are creating programs. We have one called LEAP, where we run a 6-month cohort to educate potential founders or potential founding members of these companies to keep them close to us and us close to them. We share information and exchange. Hopefully they share interest and we can tap them on the shoulder if the right business comes along where it's like, you know, hey, Dean Waller, this concept is for you, right? Like this is a business that fits right in your wheelhouse of experience and talent and your network. Like you and this business, 1 + 1 = 11. If we bring these 2 things together, that's what we're hoping for through that programming. So yeah, I would say reach out, ask about our LEAP program, ask us when our next events are. Like come get to know us so we can get to know you if you're an individual interested.
So Josh, what's the timing of this? When is it going to get going? And also, what are the cycles you're going to operate in?
Got it. Yeah, great question too. So we're hoping to launch officially here, let's say in April, without giving a specific date. So by the time this is being listened to, we're past that launch. And then, we really want to get up and running on the first cohort of concepts. So, 10 or so concepts, maybe more, that we're vetting and validating. And then we try to have we try to have Sprint Week ready. You mentioned Sprint Week earlier. Like we try to have Sprint Week every 3 to 4 months. So having 2 to 3 concepts that are baked, validated, or at least far enough along that we can hand it to a team to help do that minimal viable business shaping that you talked about. So yeah, every 3 to 4 months, we'll be going through that cycle. So again, reaching out to people, pulling them in to those Sprint Weeks, expertise, talent, like people that we know in the ecosystem here, bringing them into the process.
It's a big commitment.
Yeah.
How do you get them to agree to it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
It's a week.
Yeah, it's a week. Well, technically it's 3 days. But it's called a week. Yes, you're right. You can participate in a lighter way. Like you can just be there one day and you get a taste for what is in that process. I do think it's an educational process. Having gone through it myself at High Alpha, like I said, 6 years ago.
So you went through one?
Yeah. I was like, this is It feels like a hackathon, honestly. That's what it reminded me. Hackathons aren't a thing anymore. People don't talk about hackathons anymore.
They don't. Why?
I don't know. Nobody's running hackathons anymore.
We used to hold them. We had blockchain hackathons.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yes. Well, you need to talk to some people at the university about getting those up and running again. But yeah, I mean, it's like a hackathon. It's 3 days of intensive focus on the concept. Like, you are trying to get it as far down the field as you can. So yeah, you're right. It is hard for an individual working at, let's just say the names, JB Hunt, Tyson, Walmart, Sam's Club, wherever. Like, you're at a big enterprise in town. It's going to be hard for you to take 3 days off to invest in somebody else's concept. But the hope is that you come out of that with education, more, like, you get exposure to what startup feels like, which I think a lot of people are curious about, but don't know how to, like, how do we get a taste, right? Like, how do I dip my toe in the pool? And I think that's a unique way to get that. Like, you get to feel it.
Well, I'm just curious because when High Alpha has 60 to 65 people participate, that includes everyone that works at High Alpha, which is already 35 people. It's a big organization. Maybe it's even bigger than that now.
Yeah.
Whereas you're starting smaller.
Yeah.
But I could imagine people from some of the entrepreneurial support organizations wanting to be involved here. Maybe some of the funding companies around here, pre-seed, seed, private equity, venture capital. There's probably others. Maybe even, would it be okay for students from the university to participate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a thing we need to tap into. Like, how do we get college or degree-seeking individuals involved in the process? Again, to get that taste, to get this is what startup feels like. How different does it feel from my 9-to-5 job? And it doesn't, again, to the point I was going to make earlier, like, if all I can do is dedicate one day, you can still participate, right? Because you're right. Most of the actual team will be from our team, right? Our 8 people here in the state working for FieldBook, and then High Alpha is going to send people for each of those sprint weeks. We'll fly people in to help support those sprint weeks, so we have the extra designers and analysts and like other thought leaders in different spectrums or different functions attached to those teams, kind of doing the work. So you don't have to be there for the full 3 days. That's the ideal. But yeah, if you can only participate for one afternoon, we're going to make space for people to pop in for an afternoon, participate with one team, jump in where they can jump in. We'll be pulling in companies and individuals for interviews as part of that process. A lot of that week is, all right, we need to have already scheduled interviews with subject matter experts to refine things. So that's part of the prep work of Sprint Week. You've already scheduled a bunch of calls so that team has people to talk to bounce ideas off of. So you can participate in that way too.
Well, Josh, this is really interesting. Congratulations on founding this FieldBook and venture studio.
Yeah.
Very impressive.
Yeah, we've worked on it for a long time. We're grateful of VentureWell bringing this to life, like being a partner to make it happen. Obviously grateful to Walton Family Foundation for kind of seeding the studio to really get it ramped up. And then we're going to be seeking to bring in private investment to run Fund 2 and run Fund 3 to keep that studio cranking out companies beyond the initial investments from VentureWell. So, yeah, we're excited.
If you're finding value in this podcast, we'd greatly appreciate your support by subscribing to our YouTube channel. Additionally, following us on Apple and Spotify and leaving up to a 5-star review would be immensely helpful. We welcome any feedback or questions related to the podcast, as well as suggestions for further topics and guests. You can leave your comments on our YouTube channel, and rest assured that I will read each and every one of them. Please also take a moment to check out our podcast sponsors, as they play a critical role in keeping this podcast running. For more information on specific topics, timestamps, or links to articles mentioned during the podcast, head over to mattwallerpodcast.com.